Okay. So today's presentation is our final Nature at Noon presentation for spring 2021, but it won't be our last. The Nature at Noon lecture series will resume this fall, so please check back with our website in August for an exciting new lineup. Check at biomimicry.asu.edu. On to today's presentation, from surprise to inspiration. How many of you can recall the surprise and delight of visiting a rainforest or a desert or a coral reef for the first time? Whether traveling on vacation, visiting friends, or relocating across the country, many of us have experienced the pleasures of exploring new habitats. These places give us great joy, but they can also serve as reservoirs of inspiration for solving many of our sustainability challenges. Today, we're joining Biomimicry Center Director Dayna Baumeister to learn how we can use a biomimicry lens to understand and learn from the unfamiliar ecologies we find ourselves in. Dayna will give us a tour of her own new habitat in the Pacific Northwest and describe the ways in which the practice of biomimicry has helped her to become acquainted with some of her new plant and animal neighbors. So welcome to Nature at Noon, Dayna. Thanks for joining us from the field.
I'm so happy to be here. From the field is the best place to be doing class. So I'm really excited to be here. I hope this is showing up all right because I've got a filmmaker. My husband's holding the camera for me, and you'll have to give us feedback because I can't see my screen if we need to be in a different place.
Oh, you're good.
Sound good?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, excellent. So welcome everybody. I'm so excited to be here with you today and to be outside. And as Heidi mentioned, this is kind of a new habitat for me. We live primarily in Montana, and we're now part-time in the Pacific Northwest in Bellingham, Washington, about halfway between Seattle and Vancouver. And I'm getting to know this place. And when we were talking about a Nature at Noon series or something that I could talk about, and especially in this virtual way, I thought, oh, this would be a really cool way to introduce people to kind of what goes on maybe in my head or could go on in your head as you're learning to discover and understand new places. And this is pretty important because actually as a biomimic, one of the things that I do is I lead trips, and I lead trips in new habitats around the world. And it's impossible to know everything that you can know about a habitat before you get there. It's impossible to even know a fraction. And even if I were to lead trips, and I have led trips in Montana, I still only feel like I know a fraction, and that's a habitat that I know very well. So it's less about the knowledge of a place and more about the questions that you ask and how you go about getting to understand what's happening in a place and how your curiosity works. So I thought I would share that kind of in a real-time kind of way. I've been here a little bit, so I know a little bit now, but I still have very, very much a beginner's mind. And that's pretty important because, as I said, when I go to new habitats anywhere, and especially if I'm the trip leader, people are turning to me and expecting me to have the answers. And while I don't have the definitive answer, it's very possible to come up with a reasonable answer by using a few clues. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I hope you guys have questions that you can pop up, and because again, I can't see the screen. If it's important, Deborah, just pipe in and say, hey, Dayna, pause there for a second. We got a question that's relevant before I move on. Just a couple of other tech things. We are outside. Where I'm hoping that the sound carries and the video carries. We tested it already. It's a little difficult to walk and talk without it all getting really blurry. So probably what I will do is I'll stand in some places and talk, and then I'll find things and then talk, but I won't be able to talk while we're walking. So we probably won't cover a whole lot of ground, but the beauty of being in the Pacific Northwest and this temperate rainforest is we actually don't have to cover a whole lot of ground. In fact, Thomas, while I'm talking, if you wouldn't mind just doing a 360 to share with everybody what we're surrounded by would be great. So when you're in a new place and you're trying to get oriented, obviously your eyes are one of the most powerful senses that you can have. And being able to use your eyes, presuming you have the ability to see with those, gives you the first orientation to a place. And there's a lot of things that you can begin to look for when you come to a new habitat. One of the first is sort of that big macro lens of what kind of habitat am I in? And even if you're not trained in any formal biology or any formal ecology, you probably know the difference between a forest and an ocean, or a forest and a grassland, or a grassland and a desert. And so that's really obviously a good place to start at first. And as you can see from the view that Thomas just gave, we're in a forest, right? And so we know by definition that a forest has trees, and trees impart a structural opportunity for all sorts of things to be happening, from what's happening at the soil, to what's happening below the soil, to what's happening at the sort of mid-level. And then of course, as you go up the canopy, there's all sorts of opportunities of things that can be explored and understood. So a forest is a really cool habitat for a lot of spatial diversity to provide a lot of opportunity. So, but before I even label something perhaps as a forest, especially if I haven't even physically been in that place, one of the questions that's always really, really important to ask yourself when you're trying to learn something about a place is get to know a little bit about its temperature story and its water story. And notice I put the word story after that, not just temperature and water, but temperature and water over time. And over time, particularly over the year. Like, what does a season impart in terms of temperature and water? And there's a lot of really cool graphs out there, cool biome maps that map the world's biomes over an axis of temperature and water. And so in this particular place, I need to know, and I've learned, and you should be able to think about a habitat that you know about, what happens with temperature over time? And so you'll figure that out. So in this particular location, it turns out that especially in this temperate rainforest, which is a coastal rainforest, that the temperature very, very rarely drops below 0 Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit. It can freeze, but it's really rare, right? So that's important. Especially, that's an important threshold to know about, the 32 or 0 cutoff. But on the other end of the spectrum, it doesn't tend to get much more than maybe 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 28, 29 Celsius, which is also very interesting. So my first narrative in my temperature story that gives me some clues about the biology, right? That's all what we're trying to do, is pick up clues that'll help me understand what I see in the field, is that the temperature stays within a pretty narrow band, especially for what the planet can allow. So we know, like in Montana, for example, I know that it could get to -20 and over 100, and that's in Fahrenheit. So I've got 120 degree span of temperatures. I've got less than half of that here, maybe 25 to 85 at most, right? At most. So when you're looking at a different range of temperature, you're going to have different kinds of adaptations of the biology that you see in place. So I know the range, and as you might expect, you got to understand where you are on the planet. I'm far away from the equator, so there's likely to be seasons. There's likely to be a summer, a fall, a winter, and a spring. So knowing what those temperature shifts are, and yes, as you might expect, the below freezing happens in winter, the 80 degrees happens in the summer. But even more interesting in the temperature story is how quickly or how frequently. So in the case of temperature here, it's very much a bell curve, right? So very few days are in that really cold, relatively, right? Here they call it really cold, but of course, having lived in Montana, I know it's not really cold. So like 20 to 35 degrees, very few days there, very few days in the 70 to 85. So the bulk of the time here is that temperature's pretty moderate, which tells me that temperature's not going to be a driving factor for what I see out here, right? Probably never, close to never, which is a super important clue. And I can figure all of that out before I even come out here. So I'm not going to see adaptations that are driven by temperature because it's not really a very big factor. So you think about your habitats, your places, your new stories where you go, asking yourself that temperature threshold gives you a lot of information. And one more thing on temperature is I also am curious about the night-day shift, right? How much that shifts. If you've studied deserts at all, you know that that can be a huge change. Here, maybe 10 degrees between night and day. So very, very little shift. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the ocean influence, the big body of water, not just in the ocean, but in this habitat. It's a wet habitat, which I'll get to water in a second, also buffers that temperature change. So we've got a very narrow band. Again, another clue that life here is not having to respond to temperature. So I'm not going to be asking, oh, why is this look like this from a temperature kind of lens? Okay, so that's the temperature story. The next story is water. I'll talk about water and then we'll give you a different backdrop behind me so you can learn a little bit. So now I've gotten my temperature story for this place. Now I want to understand my water regime. So the first question that I ask is, how much water lands in a year, right? What's the total amount of rainfall in a year? And as you can see, looking around, there's a lot of life growing here. So my presumption is that there's probably a lot of water growing, or, that lands here. And sure enough, this gets to probably up to a meter, 30, 36 inches of rain a year. That's a lot of rain. And one way to think about water is to know your own place and how much water it gets, and then take that relative comparison. And so in Montana, we're actually very dry, semi-arid. Where we lived in Montana and Helena, it got 10 to 12 inches of rain a year, an equivalent mostly as snow. Right? So 10 to 12 inches versus 3 times or even 4 times that amount here is bound to have a huge difference in what I see. So now I'm starting to think that a lot of what I'm going to discover has to do with the presence of water. If I were in the desert, I would be thinking a lot about what I have to discover has to do with the absence of water. But here, it's about the presence of water. And that's going to drive my observations of what I witness, is that water is an important story. I'm also curious when that water falls. It's less important in the night-day narrative around when water falls, but when does it fall over the course of a year? And here it's definitely wetter in the winter, in the spring and in the fall. You've got a curve as well, but it's rare to go more than 6-7 days without rain falling, right? And even in the summertime. So I can learn that again before I get outside. And then I know that, okay, well, if it's only 6-7 days without water, most plants are fine to go that long without water. So it's not a water-limited environment. That's not going to drive what I see in adaptations. It's a water-rich environment, and that's going to drive those. Here's a good example, case in point, of this really in real practice. Flying down to Peru to do a workshop in the Amazon. But of course, we fly into Lima. I get in the car with a taxi driver. I need to learn about the place. So I asked the taxi driver those questions. Tell me about the temperature story. Tell me about the water story. So I asked him, how much water do you get here? And the taxi driver pauses and he goes, well, it rained once in 1977. Wow, oh my God. So water is clearly, or the lack thereof, a driving story to what I'm going to see in this habitat here in Lima. Sure enough, I look around, there's no gutters, there's no water, sewer in the street, nothing. Like water is not a factor. So learns and tells you a lot. Okay, so now I've got two really important ingredients in understanding and beginning to interpret what I'm about to see as we step outside. So let's walk just a little bit, and we'll begin to imagine then in our head, okay, if we know that we don't have to deal with freezing and we've got water and I'm in a forest, what kinds of things can I discover? So we'll come over here a little bit. Okay, so now I'm stopping in my head. I know water's a story. Temperature's not a story. And I look down and I see, first of all, that we have this long slope going down here. And so I've got topography. Topography suddenly becomes really important in my place with water. And these tree roots right below me are a really good indication that water is important in a place of topography because we have erosion. Of course, this is part of a trail, but even off the trail, I can see that the presence of a lot of water is going to cause erosion problems. Now I have a clue that there's bound to be some functional adaptations for dealing with erosion. So now I've got my biomimicry hat that's kicking on and asking, okay, erosion, that's an interesting question. I got to think about it. What is life doing here? Especially since you have these super, super tall trees, right, that are going way up. So they've got forces on them, especially probably I'm next to an ocean. I'm going to imagine that there's some pretty good wind, you know, and yeah, sure enough, there is wind here. So they've got strong forces, but yet their soil has the potential to be washing out underneath them. And so there's a good chance that there's some adaptations here around dealing with that erosion. And sure enough, as I begin to look around, and we'll point it out as we see elsewhere, there's a lot of roots that are exposed, but they can also intertwine and lock together. Who knows how many trees are represented in this pile of roots below me? And inevitably, they are locking together. Oh, now suddenly I've discovered a strategy for dealing with erosion is to interlock structures together to both hold self in place as well as to hold soil in place. Okay? So now I've got maybe direct applications for the built environment. I could think more metaphorically or more abstractly. Maybe there's design solutions that we make that allow for structures to begin to lock and loop together. But obviously, if I'm in a rainforest, and I've learned I'm in a temperate rainforest, so lots of water, if everything was exposed, all that soil would wash away. Right? So what we actually see, and if you shine around here, Thomas, you can see there's a lot of vegetation. There's a lot of vegetation. And of course, that vegetation is going to be holding that soil in place. So now I've got an emergent ecosystem phenomena of vegetation helping hold the soil in place. So I got more than one strategy that's helping hold this soil in place. So I'm starting to put pieces together to help interpret what I'm seeing because I have these narratives around temperature and water to work with. All right, so let's look a little further here along. Okay, so now I notice something and I'm looking around, I'm like, oh, this is curious. If I look at these tree trunks, and hopefully the light will show it, they're not just brown. They've got a whole green tinge to them, right? On the tops of these trees, and because I'm looking over an edge here, I can see going up a fair amount. And as we look here, you can see, and I want to get close, and And I've got lots of little lichen that looks like it's growing in the spaces. All right, so green, obviously I'm going to think photosynthesis. I'm going to think something in the plant world or in plant partnership, right? So lichen is a partnership with fungi. So I'm looking here and I'm seeing this, and again, I'm affirmed, wow, okay, so not only do I have a lot of water, I'm betting I also have a lot of humidity, right? Because lichen, especially, and as we look around and we'll see some more later, there's a ton of moss here. Like, it needs to stay moist. It doesn't have a vascular system that allows it to tap into groundwater for its source. There's no roots here. It's merely tapping into the moisture that might be absorbed slightly by the bark, but more likely is coming from the atmosphere. So now I've started to stitch things together. I've got moisture in the air. The moisture is permitting a whole bunch of new niches in this place that allows for the lichen to grow on the surface. And then just right here, just to your side here, Thomas, is I've got moss, right? So now I've got moss growing on this tree. And if I look closely, there's clearly a long sort of fringed moss that's here. But then there's also patches of the lichen that are coming in, and there's probably more than one. Yep, looks like there's a couple of different species of moss that are showing up. Makes sense. My clues are coming together. I got a lot of moisture. I've got, as I mentioned before, when I have a tree, I have more structural opportunities to begin to find niches. I've got this whole layering opportunity as I go up. And in fact, as you keep going up the tree, you can see that these patches of moss are all the way up there. And they're expanding, right? And then naturally, as a biomimic, I need to start asking questions. I'm curious, how do they attach? I begin to start thinking about functions. How are they locked in to this surface area? If there's that much water, why don't they wash away? What holds them in place? Why are there different colors? Why is the lichen kind of this blue-green and this moss a different color green? And you might be able to see that some of the moss is an even darker sort of brownish color green. I want to begin asking those questions. What does that constitute? What makes that possible? And then, naturally, hopefully I start as a biomimic thinking about how could I learn something differently and what might I learn from here? All right, let's walk to a new spot. And Deborah, please let me know if any questions are coming in or people want me to spend more time or if they see something that they want an explanation for.
Sure.
All right, so let's actually look at these fiddleheads. These fiddleheads are pretty cool. So we're in spring, right? Life is springing, and I'm observing a couple of different things going on here. One thing that's really cool that I'm learning about the temperate rainforest is there's a lot of evergreen, right? There are perennials that stay constantly green. Of course, we have our cedars, and we have our Doug fir, our coastal Doug fir, sort of the conifer group, but even the ferns are staying evergreen. But if you look here, I got a couple of different colors of green that are happening. And as you might imagine, these larger fronds that are down low, I'm thinking about them, they're dark green, they're bigger, so naturally I'm going to assume that they're older. And then there's lighter green leaves coming up, and as we know, they all have these fiddleheads. The fiddleheads are starting to open up. A few weeks ago, these would have been curled up even more. Naturally, as a biomimic, I'm curious about the packing phenomena that's going on here. You have the ability to sort of, when a fiddlehead is all curled up, and it's curled up bidirectionally, it's opening along this axis, and also the leaves are uncurling and unfurling along a different axis. But I'm curious, like why light green and dark green? It's not just that green gets old, it's not really oxidizing and turning brown. Well, and in this case, I happen to know as a biologist that there's two types of chlorophyll. There's chlorophyll A and there's chlorophyll B. And chlorophyll B is really good in low light situations. And chlorophyll B happens to be a darker color green. So I know that means, and I've never, looked under a microscope or even read a scientific paper, but I know enough that there's going to be more chlorophyll B in these older leaves, whereas chlorophyll A is a lighter green, and that's going to be in these younger leaves. Chlorophyll A happens to be able to handle bright light, and it photosynthesizes really well. It's got high efficiencies in bright light, but it doesn't live very long, right? It doesn't last very long. It's sort of like go fast, die young. Whereas chlorophyll B is actually really resilient, and that makes sense, right? So in an evergreen forest or in any sort of perennial, you're more likely to see this dark green because I need the chlorophyll to keep on churning out for me. And as I look around and I look at the cedars, they're a dark green, and of course that's because they're around all the time. But the light green is here, and it's possible in the spring because I'm actually in a mixed forest. Not only do I have evergreens, so I've got needled leaves or needled trees, I also have deciduous trees. So if we look here and we look at that cluster of trunks over there, that's actually what's called a maple. We've got big leaf maples here. And if you look up, there's a fair amount of light that's coming through the canopy. And that light is, of course, what these young fern leaves can partake in. So they're beginning to have a narrative that matches the fact that I have seasons and that some leaves are shed, right, by some of these maple trees, but a lot of the trees are conifers so that they can grow year round. Right? So I'm starting to put all of these pieces together, and my curiosity and delight is just, we don't have ferns in Montana. So now I can begin to ask some relative questions. How does this compare to a habitat I know very well? And a lot of Montana, there's a few places ferns occur, but they only occur in really wet environments. So now I'm beginning to put some pieces together. I don't know anything. There's a bracken fern. That's all I know about it. But I now have discovered that, it must need water, right? It must need water as an important source. So then I'm going to ask the question, well, why? What does it need water for? And it turns out, this is true of all ferns, and of course it's too early to see any of that. Ferns reproduce with spores. So if we had little dots on the backs of these leaves, we would be able to see for the spores, but there aren't any because that's going to happen later in the year. But the spores are a form of reproduction. Oh, here's some. So you see the dots on the backs of these leaves. So spores are super, super, super tiny. And because they're so tiny, that means they have a high surface area to a low volume. And a high surface area to a low volume means they can dry out very easily. And if plant material dries out, for the most part, unless you're like a resurrection fern, you're toast, you're done, that's it. So I need to be, if I'm a spore and I want to ensure my survival, I need to be in a humid, moist environment. And that's why you see ferns in humid, moist environments. Now my biomimic mind starts kicking in, right? Well, if staying wet is so important to spores, what's the outside of a spore coat like? And what could I learn from that about trying to maintain moisture? What could I learn about dispersion methods for dust in the spores? Actually, I was going to show that mosquito you just swapped away. The mosquitoes here are huge, right? It just also tells me something. But anyhow, so I'm back to my fern. So I've got all sorts of questions. I might be asking, well, why are they all lined up this way? And what is that, and how does that help for the dispersion? And if I'm interested in the question of dispersion of small particles, you know, what can I learn from ferns? And oh, look, lo and behold, they're on the underside. Well, they're probably on the underside so they don't dry out being exposed to the sun. Okay? So hopefully you're starting to see that even if you don't have biology training or ecology training, you can start putting together your clues, even from the little bit that you know in one particular habitat, and start to learn and be able to better interpret what's happening in a new habitat that you come to. So let's see what else we can find.
Dayna,
Oh, I guess maybe, oh, go ahead.
yeah, we do have one question. Can you read it, Heidi? I can't see it.
Yeah. When you see roots, because there is erosion, do you find that the trees intertwine their roots with nearby trees under the soil to self-stabilize?
Yes, most definitely. So let's see. Well, here's some examples of this. All right. So here we've got this one tree here, and sorry, we have a new dog that's joined us. This tree here, and if we look down, we see these roots. This root is clearly coming off of this tree. This is actually a branch off of this original tree, but its roots, right, are connecting. But now if I go just to the right over here, I've got a different species altogether. I can track some of its roots coming down, right? And so underneath here, I can see that I've got this root, probably is this one coming here. It's going down and it's coming underneath this root coming here, right? And so you have a huge interweaving. And that's why, and you also see that in the tropical rainforest as well. And that's why it's a huge catastrophe, or I don't know, catastrophe maybe is not the right word. It's a huge disturbance when a large tree falls in a rainforest, because it often can rip out and take down all the branches of all the adjacent trees that are moving around, that are interwoven and attached to it. And it's the other thing that you see here too, and actually Thomas, come over here and look, that buttressing that's so characteristic of a tropical rainforest is also really prominent here in a temperate rainforest. So that buttressing is very much around some self-stabilization for its own tree, but also that it gets the roots out further in order to intertwine with other adjacent trees. And this is a beautiful trunk, by the way, it's just gorgeous. And look at these little ferns. This is probably not a bracken fern. This is probably another species of fern. And the way I know that is that it's not growing in the same morphology, right? So even though it's clearly a fern, it has a fern shape. If you look over here at the bracken fern, all of the leaves, multiple leaves, are coming out of, a base, and there's a base cluster. So that is a growth form. But over here, we've got single individual leaves, and there's a long stem, right? So I'm already thinking different species. I have no idea what species it is. I couldn't tell you anything more about it. But by looking at clues like that, I can imagine, okay, that's probably a different species, probably one that's well adapted to a spore landing in a pile of moss on a vertical surface, so that you get this little bit of stem that comes out, that you get far enough away from the tree that you can catch a little bit of light to photosynthesize. So putting clues together about what I see. And I'm seeing lots of just grabbing the niches, right? Now, hopefully what you're seeing here, I haven't just been using my eyes, but I'm starting to use my fingers, right? I'm starting to use touch. I'm curious about what this feels like. I can almost feel the moisture in here. Remember, I said that there's no vascular system. Moss is so cool like that. There's the way water travels in moss. If you look really close, see how there's all these little tiny fractions? Those little parts allow water to travel using capillary action. So there's not a tube inside of this. The water is actually wicking around the outside. If you remember back in chemistry class in high school where you saw the meniscus and water get pulled up the side of the test tube, that's that effect of capillary action. Because it's so small and it's divided so small, then the water wants to wick and pull. And that's how water moves through a moss bed, which is why moss is only found where there's a lot of water coming from the sky, because it can't tap into roots down into the ground. So, all right, actually, while we're here, I will share with you that at some point, right, you can't just make up everything, right? You can't just like hypothesize, and you want to be curious. And it's worth picking up one or two general natural history books for a particular location. I happen to find these two on my shelf. This is the Great Northwest Nature Fact Book, right? And the other is a Field Guide to the Pacific Northwest. And I find these sort of general naturalist books, I've now bought them for all the habitats that I go to. I'm not all that interested in making sure I identify precisely a particular species. At some point in my biomimicry research, it might be really important to know exactly that species. But most of the time when you're out in the field and you're trying to learn and just sort of understand what sort of functional things are going on and what might give me some clues that could be interesting. Maybe I want to understand cantilevering in this fern that's down here on the branch. Having a general book, because again, they're written in a general fashion to cover the things you're most likely to see. And there won't be much, but a few paragraphs can suddenly ground you both in the assurance and the confidence that your rudimentary identification skills have served you well, but also giving you perhaps even some clues and some natural history that you didn't get to see, you didn't get to experience or to hear. But because you read that paragraph in the book, you might look a little bit closer next time. Or even cooler, oftentimes it can give you a really cool biomimicry story, something of an interesting adaptation that now warrants deeper research. So having a couple of basic natural history guides with you as you're exploring a new habitat is really handy.
Okay, Dana, we have a question. Also, we lost your video just there for a second, just at the end.
You lost my video?
Well, we see your picture.
But you got it back now. Okay. Let me double check. Okay.
There you go. And I'll have.
All right, good.
Again, I'm sorry, I can't say it right.
Yeah, Dana, before you leave the mosses and lichens, we have a question about that.
Yeah.
Do mosses and lichens share a symbiotic relationship with trees, maybe protecting the tree against attacks by beetles, etc.?
Great, good question. So symbiotic relationships, that's my favorite topic. That's actually, I got my PhD studying symbiotic relationships, so good question. And actually a little bit of clarification on language, it's just important to know. Symbiotic from the Greek means living together. So sim is together and biotic, life living together. And clearly they're living together. We've got the moss and the lichen that's living together with this tree. When we talk about the type of relationship that they may have when living together, if it's a benefit to both parties, then we would call it a mutualism. And if just one party gets something out of it, but the other one is sort of net neutral, it's got a term called commensalism. And personally, I think a commensal relationship is one in which we just haven't yet discovered the mutualism, right? We don't yet know what could be in it for the party that's supposedly neutral. So most ecologists would most likely describe this relationship between the moss and the lichen as a commensal relationship, where clearly the moss and the lichen are getting structure, right? They get a place to hang out. If they weren't there, then they couldn't really make it on the forest floor, especially when you can see all these leaves that would quickly fall and cover their surface. And they wouldn't be able to do very well. So they get a sort of a risk-free home to live. They get exposure to the humidity, especially if it's coming in, and they get access to light. So there's lots of benefits for the moss and lichen that are living here. In fact, in some cases, like you can see, this one was growing on a branch or growing on a trunk, and that trunk decayed. Oh, we'll get to talk about slugs in a minute. See what happens when you pick things up, all the cool things you get to discover. So we'll take a look at these slugs in a second. But before we go to slugs, let's look here at this. So this moss is probably not going to make it, right? Because I just picked this up off the forest floor. It came off of a trunk that lost its bark, and then now it's going to be likely covered up by the vegetation, dead leaves, whatever, sticks that fall on it. So it's mostly a beneficial until the tree decides I've had enough. And in some cases, especially in the tropics, trees can be overwhelmed by the moss and lichen that grow on them and intentionally shed their bark because it's too much weight, maybe too much surface area. So all that being said, I'm not going to rule out that the tree might not get something out of it. Certainly there's a lot of moisture that's captured in here, and moisture can be advantageous, but it's advantageous maybe as a temperature buffer. But if you think back to what I said before, temperature is probably not a driving factor here. We also know that water limitation is not a driving factor. So the fact that the moss could, maybe trickle some water down to the roots, yeah, but there's plenty of water, so there's probably not a huge advantage to that. The one place where it might make a difference, and this has been documented, actually interestingly, in mistletoe, which is considered generally a parasitic infection on a plant. Mistletoes can get in and they cause all sorts of growth forms like witch's brooms, and they can actually kill off a tree. But before they do that, it turns out that witch's broom and that infection results in a lot more biomass falling to the ground beneath the tree, both from the leaves from the mistletoe itself, as well as the berries from the mistletoe, as well as the poop from the birds that sit on the mistletoe to eat the berries. And there is evidence, they've actually done carbon tracing, that some of those nutrients make it back into the tree. And so there is perhaps a beneficial loop here. But my intuition says this is probably more of just a commensal, but the tree may be getting something out of it that we don't yet know about. So there's my answer to that question. All right, let's talk about slugs. All right, now I shouldn't act all that excited because I don't really like slimy things all that much, but these slugs are pretty cool. And as you may be aware of, in the Pacific Northwest, they can grow really big. They have banana slugs here, so named because they grow to be the size of bananas. In fact, these look like banana slugs. They're just really small in their particular space or size right now. So what I want to point out, and why slugs are interesting, of course, is because of their mucus. And maybe with a light you can see that shiny bit that's behind this particular slug sliding around. And that's its mucus that allows it to travel across the surface without getting caught up on a rough surface. And so certainly as a being, come here, I'm not going to hurt you. All right. Oh, so look, so now he's put out some slime to say, and he's going to roll up in a ball and say, you don't want to eat me. Don't eat me. Okay, he's not going to let me do it. But you watch how he pulled up into a ball. What's really cool is both that they allow them to stick, but also slide. Okay, if you're a biomimic, you should be like, whoa, how do I stick and slide? How can I have lubricants that are both attach, but don't always attach, right? So I need to stay attached, but I don't want to stay permanently attached. And as we know, things like mucus are really good at absorbing water and moisture very quickly. But yet they also can hold that water. So mucins, from a chemical perspective, are fascinating, and there's tons of interesting opportunities to learn from them from a biomimicry perspective. So I will let these shocked slugs return to their home under the bark. But lots of discoveries, even just by looking in unusual places. Okay. Let's see what else. We have only gone like 15 feet, just to be clear, which is the story of being a biomimic in the woods. Things that, and we've had plenty of people walk by us on the trail, missing all of the delights if you just slow down and look. So I will see what else we can find around the corner here. Any other questions that are coming through while I'm walking?
Not a question, but a thank you for an exhaustive answer. Truly appreciated.
Okay, good. Well, we got to cover lots of ground, right, in what we have to offer here. And what's fascinating about these places, what I want to see if I can find is what happens in these forests that is really, really cool is that when you have heat, right, and I'm not going to say warm temperatures, but above freezing, that for biota, heat constitutes above freezing. When you have warmth and you have water, life flourishes, life just thrives. And so even you've got in a scene like this, you've got quote unquote new life, right? You have spring life happening. But even though you may see this as, a dead tree, and indeed it is a dead tree, but the decaying processes that are going on here are just amazing. Oh, here we have a little mating going on. Check out these two. Uh-oh, that's mosquito mating. Do we interrupt it? Right? So here we've got, you see the size of the mosquitoes. That's my fingernail. And these mosquitoes, I don't know if you can see them on the surface, I've interrupted them in copulation. I don't know that I've ever seen two mosquitoes mating before. But here they are. Spring has sprung, right? So here we have new life forming. And they are locked together in their abdomen. My guess, as in the case of most insects, is that the female is the one going away. She's the larger of the two. Here we go, and I can see them better on my hand. Oh, maybe it's not a mosquito. It's some sort of other insect. I don't see a long poking proboscis. But usually in insects, the male is the smaller of the two, and the female is the larger. And he apparently is along for the ride, but he's not letting go for this. So looking closer, right? That's what I was just saying. And again, my biomimic mind is fascinated by the joints that are happening in these insects. I'm curious about the claspers that are holding on, right? There's some sort of interesting attachment mechanism between the male and the female that might be interesting to understand how two things attach and probably still allow some sort of, she's carrying his weight wholly, fully in her arms. What's happening at the tips of her legs that allows her to hold on to the micro grooves in my finger, right? I've got all of those questions. Now I've got questions. If you see there's some structural color, perhaps you can see it in the wings. What's happening with these wings that creates that structural color and that iridescence? What gives the material, the resilience in the wings? And I don't even know what species it is, but I can tell you it's an insect because it has 6 legs. Right? So this is where you start, right? This is where the curious mind goes as you're thinking about all of these pieces. Okay, let's see what else we can find in this forest. I'd definitely be curious to hear some questions or thoughts or reflections from folks about how you, you know, the questions that you might ask. Oh, here we go. As you're exploring, and then what you do with that question when you don't have the answer, right? Like when you don't have the immediate answer, how are you assembling the clues in your own head as to begin to understand what might be going on? So think about that as I found a few more things here that I'm curious about, so came over here. So this is, looks like a dead birch. And birches, of course, are super interesting. As I mentioned before, remember some trees sort of shed their bark. And this is going to be one where we're going to see a lot more bark shedding because, and this hasn't been down for too long, so we'll see if we can see it. But one of the reasons that this particular tree has such thin bark is it actually photosynthesizes. See if I can, it might be down too long, so the chlorophyll might be gone. But it has chlorophyll in its whole trunk. And so if it's got a lot of, there we go, if it's got a lot of moss and lichen on it, then it can't photosynthesize. And so it's going to shed, you know, it's going to let those outer layers sort of peel off, and then anything that's attached to it will fall off so that it can do its photosynthesis. So again, as a biomimic, I'm super interested in this material, right? You have this really, really fine cellulose type material. It's like paper. Some people call it a paper birch. Some birches are paper birches, but yet it's really resilient. It's much stronger than paper, but it's actually even thinner than our paper. So what's going on with that? How does it create the white? How does it create a white? This is, of course, an old one, but if it were a standing tree, how does it create such a brilliant white? It's certainly not using chlorine like we might use. And then I'm also fascinated, with these are called shelf fungi, and they're actually a lichen that no, maybe they're not. I think they're a fungi. But of course, they are growing, and here's this a bigger one. There's a bigger one here. They grow in layers, like each layer, kind of like a shell. It looks like they're assembling and growing a layer and holding the shelf. And of course, the shelf will capture the moisture. Here's one over here that has started to decay, so I can open it up and see the inside, and you can see these long channels that probably go from the surface and help carry moisture inside the surface. But it's got also a shell, right? Super interesting. What's happening on the outside? As the biomimic, I want to know about this shell. What's the shell made out of? And how is that different than this porous inside? And what are those pores for? And what are they transporting? How can I think about materials that might be wicking water, probably? Perhaps there's some spore movement that's going up. Well, here's a really good view that's not so decayed, right? See all of those little fine channels that are coming up in there. So lots of interesting, and they have some resilience to them as well. So the material properties of what you find out in nature have a huge amount to offer us. You know, we've got spongy. So then I'm asking questions about how do we manage our own materials? How can we manage the decay process so that we have functionality at different stages of decay? Lots of important questions emerge that we could learn from as this tree is decaying in the rainforest, but yet giving so much opportunity for all of the benefactors that are making use of this decaying process. Okay. So another thing that I might mention is if you're studying to be a biomimic and you're curious about how can you better prepare for what you see when you go out in the world, is learning a little bit like from these natural history books, but it doesn't have to be from a site-specific place, but like just learn some basic things about ants, right? For example, there's a good chance you're going to find an ant anywhere you go. Learn some basic things about moth, right? Even though you don't know what species it is, learn those basics about moth, like I mentioned, about having the no root system, and it has to transport its water through capillary action. And then you'll be able to speak to that when you inevitably encounter moth. Or as I said before, like over here, you can look out here and you see, like here's a young maple. Oh, it's bright green. Somebody wants to know, they're going to ask you, why is that bright green? Well, learn some of those things about chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and then you can begin to unpack, right? Again, I don't know exactly what this species is, but I can tell you about chlorophyll A. We can talk about this unpacking mechanism, right? There's a deployment strategy that's going on here in these leaves. That's pretty cool. You can begin to talk about that. Learn about leaf veination and why are there so many different forms of leaf veination and what does that offer us? And then it doesn't matter what you discover out there because you've learned about basic principles of dendrites or fractals or the role that veins play, and then you can speak about those when you see them in the field, even if you don't know precisely what species this is. And I'm not even 100%, this is a maple, but it kind of looks like a maple leaf. So I'm going to say, it's probably a maple. That's where I'll start my research. I know I've seen other maples with opposite leaves, but then now I can go and learn a little bit more. But I'm not completely ignorant about what this offers because I know something about deciduous trees. I know a little bit about maples. I know a little bit about chlorophyll. I know a little bit about leaf veination. And suddenly I can start putting all of those data points together to begin to understand a little bit more about what I'm seeing when I'm out there and thinking about being a biomimic. So let me pause. Yeah.
Yeah, we're pretty much at time. This has been really fascinating.
Oh, perfect. Because my phone is at time too. It's giving me warnings of low battery.
There you go. Well, we've got a lot of great comments that we're going to send on to you. We'll save the transcript.
Oh, perfect.
And,
okay, great.
People have really enjoyed it. Very fascinating.
They're saying they'll never take a hike the same way again.
Perfect. And you shouldn't. And literally, Thomas can turn around and you'll see the distance that we traveled, like maybe 30 feet. And if you take the B Pro program or you go on one of our immersions, you'll know that it's quite literal. Biomimics walk at a snail's pace because of what we see and what we discover. And I hope that whenever you go out, you begin to ask yourself these questions. And you'll begin to see, hopefully you'll start seeing nature in entirely new ways. And I didn't even get into sound. Hopefully you can hear the birds and that gives me clues. And I didn't get into smell. You can also use taste wisely, and cautiously perhaps, but all of your senses can be part of your narrative for beginning to understand place.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dayna. Hope you're going to spend the rest of the afternoon in the forest.
Oh, I wish. If I didn't have grading to do, then I might just do that. But there's always grading, especially at the end of the semester. But I'm glad this worked out. Sorry we got rained out last time. And if I've not ever been on a walk in the woods with those of you who are online, I hope we get to do so someday soon.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.